Today we're looking at the history of Jim Crow laws. Hello, welcome to the Daily Bell Ringer. Please don't forget to subscribe and take a look at the questions down in the description. Also, don't forget to check out dailybellringer.com where you'll find more resources that go with many of the Bell Ringer videos. The period of Jim Crow laws in the United States is an offensive and sad part of American history. The discrimination and purposeful unfair treatment of African Americans by both states and local governments is a scar on the history of the nation that still is in the process of healing. What were Jim Crow laws? Jim Crow laws were laws that were in place from the late 1870s as Reconstruction was coming to an end through the 1960s as the Civil Rights Movement was able to win victory against these unjust laws. Jim Crow laws sought to suppress the rights of African Americans by making it more difficult for African Americans to vote, hold a job, get an education, or freely participate in society. The term Jim Crow comes from a stage character portrayed by actor Thomas Dartmouth Rice in the 1830s and 40s, which depicted a very negative and mocking portrayal of African Americans. Prior to the institution of Jim Crow laws, many states had adopted black codes in an attempt to deny the rights of African American citizens. As the Civil War came to an end in 1865, the nation entered into a time period of Reconstruction as leaders attempted to piece the country back together after 4 years of fighting, and slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment. Former enslaved people found themselves with new freedoms and were seeking to find work and stability within society. But as new freedoms were introduced, many whites, particularly in the South, sought to keep former enslaved people in a state of slavery. The predecessor to Jim Crow laws were the Black Codes. These codes included laws such as African Americans and whites could not intermarry, African Americans could not serve on juries, could not testify in court against a white, and could not own land, and also required African Americans to sign contracts with landowners to work on their land, for example, in a sharecropping arrangement. And then if they did not have a contract, they could be declared as a vagrant and arrested. And to learn more about sharecropping and the Black Codes, check out my other video devoted strictly to that topic. Coupled with the Black Codes were racially driven organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan that physically attacked, terrorized, and killed former enslaved people, and law enforcement in the South did little to stop their actions. During Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877, Northern lawmakers and equal rights advocates were able to undo or halt several of these Black Code practices. But with the end of Reconstruction coming in 1877, as federal troops were pulled out of southern states, ensuring that federal laws were followed, the era of Jim Crow began to grow. Southern states began to pass laws requiring separate facilities for white and African American or colored citizens. In 1890, the state of Louisiana outlawed African Americans and whites from riding together on trains in the same rail cars. Equal rights advocates challenged the law, and eventually the case of Plessy versus Ferguson was heard in the Supreme Court in 1896. The Supreme Court upheld the law and argued segregation was legal as long as separate but equal facilities were available. Of course, none of these facilities were equal. Spaces reserved for African Americans were underfunded and were very poorly maintained by the states where these laws were in place. By 1898, the Supreme Court again upheld Jim Crow laws by approving a Mississippi voting law that did not allow illiterate citizens to vote, which basically excluded former enslaved people who had had no opportunity for an education. Other states began to pass voting restrictions, such as only those that owned property could vote or prove that their grandfather had voted in order to have the right to vote. These laws severely limited African American involvement in government. For example, in 1896 in Louisiana, there were over 130,000 registered African American voters. 8 years later, there were barely 1,300. From there, Jim Crow grew with laws that segregated almost every aspect of life, from segregated schools, playgrounds, waiting rooms, restaurants, elevators, neighborhoods, even segregated cemeteries. Beyond segregation, African Americans faced the threat of violence as the KKK grew in power. African American schools and churches were burned, and thousands of African Americans were murdered by lynchings or hangings. Race riots became common throughout the early 1900s as African Americans fought for equality. In 1909, the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was formed to try to protect the rights of African Americans. The era of Jim Crow would last for almost 100 years. Gradually, the Supreme Court declared several of these laws unconstitutional, and through the work of the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, the Jim Crow era was finished. But unfortunately, the damage had been done through years of discrimination and unfair treatment, and the effects of the Jim Crow era are still felt to this day. So with that, hopefully you learned something, and thanks for watching.